Welcome to Fontribute, where we talk about fonts and their attributes. Fontribute. It's me, Thomas Jockin of TypeThursday, going solo today. So let's get started on this new season of Fontribute. We got a whole bunch of episodes planned out. So let's get started. So I started on this round. Within TypeThursday, we're actually investigating a new branding system for our organization. And the branding team has kind of distilled down two types of fonts, or two fonts to deliberate on, which was the most appropriate for TypeThursday's purposes. I thought, considering those facts, it might make sense to host an episode of Fontribute based on it. And those two typefaces are Open Sans and Alegreya Sans. And let's get started with that investigation of seeing, while they're both appear to be humanist sans, or sans that are a little more soft, contemporary in their feeling, let's investigate what's similar about them and what's different from a type designer's perspective. So we'll get started as our usual format with the N. I think obviously we can see some simple points first. One, as we see, there's some fun flaring occurring in Alegreya Sans that is absent from the Open Sans approach, as we're seeing. Next, we can also see the nature of the joint in the shoulder has been handled is different. There's a curvature with an abruptness, especially right there, and over here as well. In Alegreya Sans, that is absent from Open Sans over here. Take notice of those two. And then how the upper stem over here was handled is treated differently. One, it looks like the stem was kept the consistent weight across the whole area of Alegreya Sans, while Open Sans appears to have tapering. It's it's the stem on the bottom here tapers up at the section right here. Instead, Alegreya appears to have a shearing going this way, while Open Sans has a flatness across the top. I think overall, the impression you should be getting is that there's a little more of a calligraphic feeling, especially on this approach up here, as well as the flaring on the bottom down here in Alegreya Sans, that makes this feel much more rustic in feeling already from this more kind of traditional grotesque sans serif approach over on the Open Sans direction. There's actually a little bit, seems to be a bit more of a, well, one is the squareness on this side, but there is there's actually some interesting pushing. There's it appears that this is not symmetrical on the counter. You can actually see the slope over here is more gradual than this side over here. So while not as extreme of an approach from Alegreya Sans, there's still a little more nuance going on in Open Sans than a kind of generic geometric symmetrical form. So that's already we can see so far with the lowercase n. By the way, if you notice in this new season of Fontribute, what I've been doing now is to gain averaging out and balancing the x-height relationships of the fonts. So in this case, they're both aligned to the same baseline and x-height relationship, which results in Alegreya being increased by 18.5% in this case. So in general, if you were using these fonts and wanted to swap out one font for the other, the advisement would be you would have to increase the font size of Alegreya Sans by this percentage to make them comparable to each other. Along the way as well, just take note that it looks like Alegreya is heavier once you compensate for the averaging. Looks like the stem unit appears to be larger across than the Open Sans one. Let's verify that, see if I can grab it, bring it over. And answer, yeah, appears to be so. So let's see how this pans out in text setting and how those observations pan out. But in the meantime, let's continue back to drawing. Now, with the O's, again, these are more basic shapes, but we can see some cool, interesting parts. One is there's actually a slight stress in Alegreya Sans. As we can see, there's a little bit of a pushing on the contours over here and over here compared to the symmetrical approach in Open Sans. This is very subtle, but this seems to give Alegreya Sans a little more of a calligraphic feeling, the mirror what was occurring in the N. But notice it's not to the same extent. There's no abruptness, there's no kind of angularity in these counters, but it still wanted to call to some calligraphic form that the N did in Alegreya Sans. Open Sans, it follows a more traditional grotesque model, but in this case it looks, if I notice these curve profiles are not exactly the same as the N forms, but they have some relationship to each other. For example, like, it's not perfectly circular, nor is it overtly rectangular in feeling inside. That's part of the balance of a typeface, is getting those curves to relate between the N and the O, how they feel between each other. Likewise, we can see again the heavier weight from Alegreya Sans once averaged up. It appears heavier weight, and I actually my inclination might be to give which one is higher contrast. It's a little on the fence. I think Alegreya Sans might beat it out in terms of contrast slightly, but we'll see. They're very close together. That's those I would say as of right now. So onto the D, we're now starting to see some particular adjustments made. So one in Open Sans that should stand out to you is this tapering effect that's been occurred right here. Notice it goes from a perfectly rectangular stem up here to this a cutting in approach going into the joint area for the D. The general form of the bowl area of the D over here appears similar to what we saw in the N. Some similarities to that, but that's probably the most dramatic move over here. But notice that, and again on the N, the same approach was done on the bottom along the baseline for the D, from Open Sans' N to now this D. Alegreya shows a little some more differences. Well, one is, now there's a shearing on top here. There appears some fun non-linearity in this form. There's a tapering occurring, if you notice. This is not perfectly symmetrical, so if I clear the markings, let's see if I can hold it. Let's see if shift will... Oh, perfect. Cool. If I draw a perfectly straight line next to it to give you a comparison and put it next to it, do you notice how the point, basically the next here towards the top of the ascender, this is closer to the line than down here as it's moving close down to the kind of angle serif, not really a serif, but this terminal area down here in the D. This tells me this is a tapered form. So that's actually part of the reason why within the internal team we liked Alegreya, because there's a lot of these nuanced textures in the design, right? That it's not so rigid and kind of stoic and kind of washed out, or just very rationalistic in approach. I could already see that's something that caught my attention as well. The again sharp point direction was applied to here in the bottom part of this D with a smooth transition over here, mimicking kind of what we saw in the N and its shoulder joint relationship. And there's a pattern in the stress area we can see by the slight addition of weight over here as the D connected to the main stem. I say that because if you measure this and we bring this over here, we can see that this has gained weight from the vertical part of this D. So between the two, I think the clear note we can say is really down here. This is pretty distinctly what's going on very differently between them. Notice the abruptness versus the smoothness versus the abruptness, and this tail form versus this non-tail form over here. Both of them chose solutions of reduction of weights related to how the ascender of the D connected to the bowl. Their approaches were different. There's a tapering effect occurring in Alegreya, treated this way, versus this approach, kind of cutting in approach of Open Sans. So those are the approaches we can see so far. Onto the G now with more distinctive letters to see how those were approached, and we can see now more differences. There's some proportional differences. Notice how small this loop area is in Alegreya Sans versus this kind of more wider approach in Open Sans. We can see the neck, again sharp abruptness in this mode right here versus this one over here. The horizontalness of this spine versus this angular approach of the spine over here. This larger in proportion top bowl area of Alegreya versus the smaller in proportion of Open Sans. The ear approach being differently. Notice the flatness of this top versus this angular approach. And then also this, again, within the loop, this abrupt movement over here versus the smoothed out approach over here. But let's not, but don't think that open stance is super rationalistic and overly so. There's some nice pinching or approach or kind of a pinching effects here that give a little more nuance to this design than one would expect in the form. Especially in the bottom part of this G over here. It's happening a little bit also in the top part, but not as much, not in the same degree. And actually, in some ways, this is actually interesting. It's interesting that this is a little more square an approach than Alegreya Sans is an approach. I'm a little surprised about that. Actually, between the two of them, this is fascinating. I'm going to be watching this G when we move on to text settings to see how they behave with each other. Onto the A. Now we can see we can again see more nuance. So notice on the D, the kind of tapering approach. If I draw a straight line to make the points and then bring it over so you can see what I mean. Again, notice how this point, like this is touching the line, over here it is not touching the line. There's a significant white space right there. This tells me this stroke is not perfectly vertical. There's tapering occurring. If I apply the same methodology to this side, it appears it's probably stronger on the outside than on the inside. Let's verify. So let's see when this touches. Yeah, so you do see there's a stronger degree of white, of kind of tapering in, moving away from this green bar I drew on the outside than as is being treated on the inner contour area of this A in Alegreya Sans. And just take note of that versus the approach in Open Sans. This does approach a more vertical equivalent weight on this area versus here and here in Alegreya Sans compared between the two. Their bowl systems in their A, again, this as we saw from the D and the N, we see applied to the A. In this case, the sharp point over here, right, in this angular approach versus the more smooth approach in Open Sans. The terminal, again, mirrors onto the D to the A, the kind of more spur-esque element in the Open Sans versus a more of a tail approach in the Alegreya Sans. And it appears there's the bowl proportion, the proportion of the terminal on the top versus the bowl is an interesting relationship. Notice in Alegreya, it's much closer to the extrema of this bowl on the A versus a much more abrupt variance of difference between the end of the terminal on the top of the A versus the bowl completion over here. We'll see how this applies in text and how this really affects those relationships. We'll see how that pans out. Let's just take a note of that right now. On to the A. Excuse me, we just did the A, now do the T. I think the main dramatic note I wanted to see here was, again, there's abruptness and the change in curve profile. There's a slight curvature on this area right here that it's distinctly calligraphic or referencing calligraphy in some way versus compared to what Open Sans is doing, which is and it's not doing that. What is fun is unexpected in Open Sans is this approach right here. Do you see this kind of a tapered angular approach? I think it adds a little texture and flavor to it. I'm excited to see how that looks out in text. Keep an eye out for that. And I think a similar tapering approach we saw in other designs. I believe it appears it's happening here as well. Not as much on the outside. Let's see if this is the case on the inside. The answer is yes, it is happening there. Again, notice where it lines up with this green bar up here, but there's a white space difference down over there. All right, so we covered the basic forms I wanted to cover in the lowercase. So let's investigate the uppercase, the lowercase, specifically the cap height to x height relationships and ascender. So both of these apply system. This gives me an inclination of usage. This is probably meant for more running text purposes. With the taller ascender to cap height relationship, both of them do this. It appears that Alegreya is more extensive with that. And also, the cap height appears to be large. Excuse me, not cap height. The x height, it's significantly larger in Open Sans than in Alegreya. I can say there's, again, in relation of these lines. So I draw this line right here to show that relationship about from the cap height to X height, they actually seem quite similar to each other, which is a fascinating move. But in relationship to ascender of the two, so if I extend this up, say I bring it up to there, notice the difference between the two. And likewise, we can see the, again, expansion of tapering on the straight letters, as was done in the lowercase letters, as were applied as well to the uppercase letters in Alegreya sans. So on to the accents and punctuation to see how they applied. So there's some fun things. So one is, it looks like Open Sans is much larger with their accents in relationship to the other letters, right, compared to here and here. We can see that they're more loosely spaced in Open Sans and straight. Well, there's the straighter, right? There is some angling going on. It's not perfectly straight, but just not as much as the Alegreya sans approach. I would see in text to see if this is a more appropriate decision between the two of them. Within the accent character set, so again, what I do like about Alegreya sans was it's kind of a fuller approach of creating the character from the Latin alphabet letters to the accents. So again, notice the angularity of the tilde. It matches what's going on. We see in the design of the A, and a kind of fun tapering effect occurring in the this design right here. My mind's, I think it's it's a counter on a circumflex. My brain is blanking right now on that. I apologize, but notice actually some interesting moves in Open Sans as well. No, the grave and the acute. Notice that there's this curvature occurring, right? And this has actually been applied. What's interesting about an Open Sans, it's actually kind of interesting. I didn't expect that. It's actually a little unexpected comparing to the rest of the design. It's a little more flavorful than I would expect. The tilde seems to be reasonably appropriate to what I saw in the other forms. And with the question mark and exclamation point, the more open approach in Alegreya versus the more more closing approach. Actually, I would say this would seem a little light in relationship to especially in punctuation between the two. This is one of those things I want to see in text before I make a final conclusion if this is reasonable or not. So before we move on, I did want to take a second to talk about the numbers. The big note is that Alegreya sans does have the attribute of a very extensive number system. So by default, it has proportional. It has not proportional text aligned figures versus the full lining figures we see, and that you can option as well, and as well as denominators and numerators application designed as well. So I just want to give a note of appreciation of that. Open Sans by default appears to have the lining numbers. Doesn't have the same kind of flexibility of the number arrangements. Probably because Open Sans is meant to relate to the Alegreya. I said Open Sans, didn't I? I meant Alegreya sans has a serif counterpart, so I imagine this is meant to swap between the two. So whatever character set was designed for Alegreya serif, the sans serif design wanted to mirror with it, so you could switch the fonts, and so cover the same character set. So now we're on to now setting it up. So I set these to the same font size, or not font size, to the same X height relationships. So there's an increase of 18.5% on Alegreya sans. As you can tell by increasing it, you would also, to get a mirroring of the default leading setup you get from Open Sans, you would have to tighten up the leading in Alegreya. So some of the notes we can see. So obviously, I think actually the larger X height in Open Sans stands out to me. You can see the text seems just larger in relationship, even with the increase in font size. So this is so by averaging out the X height, it still feels larger, a relationship of the two. So beyond even that setting, there's a kind of, I would say, smoothness feeling. I think the kind of decisions from Open Sans are kind of a much smoother feeling versus a more textured, kind of crunchy feeling from the decisions made in Alegreya sans. I would say, so far. Yeah, I'm looking at both these choices. It would seem like, actually, I feel like in this settings, actually, the type is feeling kind of tight, actually, in relationship with both of these. It's interesting. I have to see. It might be the way I set up the document that caused this, but it does feel, this types are actually, this looks probably really good in like a mid header level, I would say. I think that might. It almost feels like this is the inclination for this. It might versus a like real types, like kind of smaller typesetting relationship. I say that because, the reason why I say this is because I'm looking at the relationships of that inner counter space, for example, right here in the N versus the space between the letters, between them, especially in Open Sans. There's a very dramatic inner spacing versus the space between the letters. This gives it a very kind of very graphic feeling, kind of pops, and it actually seems very appropriate for like this 30-point setting I set it to. I might feel like this might not be appropriate for a smaller setting, or if I was going to do that, I would track it out to compensate for that issue. Alegreya Sans seems to be doing much better, would seem to do a better job in the smaller settings out of the box by default. So that's an interesting observation I'm just seeing right now across these two design decisions so far. Let's see what else goes on when I move on to, again, a larger setting. And I feel like this is definitely the case, right? This is like 66 point versus 78.2. And yeah, I think Open Sans actually looks very good at this setting, right? I think the counter space to the inner spacing, right, between these two, I think these relationships are actually really good at this setting. It seems almost like it was designed for this purpose, I would say. So it seems that's really where this is meant to shine. Open Sans, Alegreya Sans, excuse me. I think it holds up actually not too bad. It actually seems like it has a little more robustness in terms of its spacing decisions. Now, obviously, the big note, actually, at larger settings too, you can see is actually a little more prominently the kind of tapering effects we can see in the stems and whatnot, and the approaches in the terminals, in the letters like the C, for example. And that G really stands out here against the smoothness and kind of more averaged out approach we're seeing across here. I will say, I do feel like the AT space, especially in Open Sans, does feel something's up with there. Either the RA space is too aggressive of an approach between the C and the A and the R and the A, or the A and the T space and in both cases is too loose across the board. Yeah, I mean, I do feel like it's not as severe of a difference or issue in the RTA and A and CAT spacings over here. Not as much in Alegreya Sans. So Open Sans does seem like, if I was working with this larger setting, especially, I would want to go to investigate to adjust that kerning spacing between those two. I will say, switching back, I said I was going to check the G, so let's take a second to check that out. I do need to admit that I do feel like the G in Alegreya Sans is a little out of character. It just seems a little too, considering especially how the A was approached, right? This kind of really squat proportion of that bowl, that G form seems a little out of sync with each other. Versus, I think the G approach in Open Sans is actually quite nice and does seem to work pretty well. Yes, I think that I would say that in general. I do feel like maybe a little bit the G is a little too small in relationship to the N. Like that N form is very wide. It's actually a very wide N, I will say, compared to the rest of the forms. And that next to that G does make it stand out as being a little petite between them a little bit. So it's almost actually like the case. I feel like the bowl proportion of the Alegreya Sans form is too big, and maybe the one for the Open Sans was a little too small in relation to each other, in relative to the other forms in the design, each one respectively. All right. So what can we say about this? Well, I actually think in some ways, unexpectedly, I actually had the impression Open Sans was meant to be a kind of an all-purpose text face across the board, but in the investigation, it would seem this is actually really ideal for like a subhead environment or a larger setting. The spacing and proportions are very good. It's excellent for those purposes, but I think it's actually spaced a little too tight for like kind of default out-of-box font usage on text setting. If you were going to use in those settings, I'd probably track it out a little bit. That's an advisement I would give. Alegreya Sans is if you wanted a more crunchy, texty like feeling. So this actually works really great maybe in an old style like Alegreya, it's as an old style itself, or maybe another old style like a Garamond, for example, and you wanted a sans to work with it. This might actually be a very good comparable with it. And I think its spacing proportions are a good working ground either towards text and larger settings. Probably I'd move towards, in a larger setting, I would track it in a little bit to make it snap in a little punchier, make it feel stronger in that larger setting. But in the smaller setting, I think it can hold on its own relatively fine out of the box. Maybe in really smaller settings, track it out a little bit more, but not too much. So those are the conclusions and observations so far between Open Sans and Alegreya Sans. And I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of Fontribute. Looking forward to your comments, feedbacks. Was this useful for you? Was there any points you'd like me to expand further on? Love to hear your feedback, and thanks so much for your time. Take care, everyone.